tonight my goal is basically just to give a brief run through of all the offhand weapons. The stuff that I'm working from is available in the This lecture notes, which you can get from the members website. It's normally taught in our Scholar grade, but obviously you can access that anytime you want and go have a read. Tonight I'm more interested in going through some of the choices that we've made and setting up some of the basic ideas, because a lot of it is fairly loosely put. So there's not a lot of plays in things that I'm going to do tonight. It's just perfect for me just being by myself to talk about some weapons. And I thought I'd set my task of 10 minutes per weapon just so that I don't get carried away on some. I think some of them I'm going to be pushing it to keep it in 10 minutes, and some of them I'm going to be pushing it to make it to 10 minutes. So I'm going to try timing it. I'll see how that works with my glove. And if that's not the case, I might get Eddie to pick me up. Okay, so starting my 10 minutes. The first offhand weapon I'm going to do is buckler. And it's mostly just because that's the one that I've been working on lately. And I'm really enjoying it. It's also the one that I've had most success with in tournaments and stuff. Eddie, it's asking me to admit people to the room. Can you do that? Oh dear, horribleness. Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so Figgy wants a quite large buckler. So he says 2 palmos, which this one is not even quite. So 2 palmos is approximately this wide. You can see, if I step into range, you can see that my fingers are a little bit beyond this. I chose this one to be about the maximum that most of our local tournaments take, which is 40 centimeters, and 2 palmos between 42 and 44, depending on which palmo we use. He says to hold it naturally, which I kind of like, and I kind of assume is the same sort of natural hold that he's talking about with a sword, where they're talking about that. So it's just placing your hand in here. There's no fancy turns or twists like you might see in some of the bolognese and so forth. He talks about catching the blows on the upper edges, usually on the outside edge. And that combined with a few other things, he says to support it with your thumb on the back. So between those two combinations, I tend to prefer to have it much more square on rather than at an angle. Though it doesn't specifically say not to use the angle. It just then becomes much harder to catch things on this outside. And the thumb support starts to fade away if you're turning away from it rather than turning into it. I know a lot of people that I've said this to kind of find the thumb support can be jarring, and I think it's all about ensuring your structure is like this. If you have your thumb up and have the end of your thumb on the buckler instead of the pad, you can sort of jar it in funny places. Or if you have it too flat and it's the lower pad of the thumb, then that tends to bend your thumb backwards. So it's sort of just aligning the bone structures through your thumb here to give you that maximum support. You see I've worn a nice little spot on my buckler from where it goes. Okay, so the other things, with all the offhand weapons, he says they're ancillary to our primary weapons. So it's basically we're assuming that we do our distressor as normal, which is slightly complicated by the fact that we haven't translated all of Figgy. So we're kind of assuming that our distressor as normal is the same as Pacheco, Ettenhard, all the other ones that we're using. As we get more Figgy, there seems to be some more things coming in. So obviously the offhand weapons will be influenced by that as well. In principle, he says that we start with our L shape, which you can't see with my feet, but that's just our normal L that we have for our feet. And he wants us to square up the body a little bit more and bring the buckler out forward. So there's a gap between the hilt and the sword so that we can see, but the buckler needs to be high enough that any blow that strikes this outside edge is going to guide up and out to my outside. So he says to hold it slightly to our outside. So rather than directly from the shoulder, it'll be slightly out. And this depends a lot on the size of the buckler you do. So if you're using a buckler that's significantly smaller than what Figgy says, then you need to move it out a little bit more to ensure that everything that's just deflected is straight off the top. One of the drills we just do to get that ingrained into people, just how little they need to move that buckler, is to have it in there, and then we get their training partner to slide the sword across that top, and they can see that one that would be aimed at my head, where I can actually see what's going on still, is actually going to be deviated out by the edge by the time it gets to me. Okay, so yep, he says out here, keep it away. This is pretty good. He says blows need to go under the buckler when we're throwing them, which becomes a little interesting, and it's sort of like it gives you the basis for a lot of our actions. So you tend to find that you're using them in the pairs like this, where you'll angle the sword low to strike in the lower area while leaving this buckler up in its primary place. You can see that especially when they're throwing large Atajos, so cuts on their primary side. You can see that you can use this in here, catch it earlier, and transverse in. So you deliver that thrust low while keeping your buckler up here. This buckler does start to obscure your vision, which you can see just from the video there. You can see that you can only see about 3/4 of my face. And the low sword catches in case they redirect down towards my legs or body area here. I find if it's mixed hand, it still works really well against their primary Tahoe. So that will mean for me, I'll be stepping, or you'll be stepping to your outside if they're the opposite hand to yourself. With this, you then have to move this buckler over, but you want to move it no further than the other side, than the edge side of your body. So we're just moving it this minor about, and that means the point is below it now. Much more at risk of completely obscuring your vision, which you can see is a problem there when you're bringing it up on that outside. Most of the time you want to receive cuts and so forth still on that outside with just the sword rather than obscure the vision. But it's still that they're doing that large cut motion. You tend to be able to see that cut, pull it on. Once again, I will be able to because they're cutting high. And if you lose it, they're going to cut down into the side of the sword because you've made that wall there that's all outside my body. So there's nowhere for them to bring that sword around. Some of the other things I quite like with this is once we catch it on the edge of the buckler is you'll hand off to the sword. So it's kind of the opposite to what you might see in a lot of other systems where you like catch it on the sword, place your buckler on it and go. This one you find yourself often that you'll be doing something, the hit lands on the sword and then you're like placing your Atajo and going in. So you're using the buckler to provide the initial defense and then using the sword to pick it up from there to deliver it on. What other important points did I need to get across? Deliver the point. Let me see, is that my 10 minutes yet? I don't think it is. Excellent. Okay. So the other place where you'll deflect with the buckler is underneath. So we'll often take the Atajo out here, and this can stay up here. So this, we're deviating, diverging our hand and the buckler. So it's not like I-33, I don't want to bring it in covered like this. I've now got a complex hilt. So most of that coverage of my hand is much better done with the separation. But then if, as I stretch out for the thrust, they've counted in that lower area, then it's still quite fine to move this into that area here. And you can see that once again, I'm not pushing that edge. I'm not pushing the edge of the buckler past my body, and I'm just picking up enough. This is once again one of those areas where once you've deflected it with the buckler, you'll like pick it up with the spiral or something else to bring it back into the game, pass it off into your sword. Yeah, so one of the drills that we do with this is when we're under the Atajo, So if someone places an Atajo on my sword, let's imagine towards my inside with this buckler, then I'm able to retake the strength by raising my hand a little bit and adjusting that as I step. And then I can use the buckler to push out their sword and push it to the other side, and then thrust in below. So this is that time where the person that I was doing that to, they'd come in, they'd think, oh, I've got to go to Atajo and thrust. They lose that strength within that time, and then they have to use their own buckler to shut out this low area. Lama, lama, lama. Lama, lama, lama. Okay. Any questions on buckler before we move on? No?
Might the buckler be of a more reasonable size if like your average like 16th century Spaniard had smaller hands than like a 21st century person? Just on the palmer, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the palmo was a measurement. I think Portuguese was 21.5 centimeters and Spain was 22.
Yeah, so still 2 palmos are still pretty big.
So yeah, my hand matches a Portuguese palmo. So.
Oh, sweet, okay, yep.
So deviation of people, maybe they were using their ideal, maybe we're not that different. But yeah, so that sort of fits into there.
Yep, okay, that makes sense, yeah.
Yep. Okay, any more questions, or we're going to move on because that's my 10 minutes. No,
you're free to move on, but just try not to leave the frame. Because on some of your because on some of the bits where you were moving to your inside, directions hard. You were leaving the frame, and so we couldn't see the thing you were telling us about. It was only very briefly.
Oh dear, please yell out. So this is about, see, on my video preview, which is what I'm doing, I'm still in frame, is that correct?
You are, but you're barely there, like part of your right arm is cut off.
Okay, cool, not too bad. And over here, I've just lost my left arm.
Yep, now your left arm is gone.
Good. Okay, that's not too bad. Okay, so next we have okay. So let's start 10 with this one too, and see how I go with that. So with the cape, Business has already put up videos of Lewis and I doing a workshop that covers quite a lot of this stuff. So it's really cool. I suggest you check it out. We're all outside. You get to see some of the other people learning it and trying it for the first time, which is really cool. So it doesn't give much direction on how big the cape is or what material it's made out of. So we're just using other sort of knowledge of the time that it's a wool cape and is full circle. Most of this we got from the historic cape maker in Spain. That yeah, it was a slightly later period where the capes that they were from, but they were assumed to have followed through from the earlier period. The length is a little in dispute. We initially thought that lots of them were quite long, like you can see that's further than the frame takes it. So that's right down to my calves. On further investigation, it just tended to be social status and/or trend. So basically, the less you needed your cape to work functionally, the shorter it was. So the more money and comfort you had in life, the shorter your cape was, and the less, the longer. So it was quite often considered villainous to have a cape as long as I do here. With the preparations that we use, this is probably a tiny smidge too long for what I want to be ideal, but it works, it does the job. Okay, so what does he say? He says that it's a waste just to leave it on your shoulders and not do anything with it. Yeah, it's silly to throw it aside and possibly lose your cape or incriminate yourself. So that might have been Gordinio that was worried about incriminating himself. Seems much more like a Gordinio issue. Figgy says that we should have a single wrap around the arm. So he's definitely saying don't drape it, but do not use up too much cape in covering it off, so that you still have a good length. And there's basically two forms that we've accepted, and one is just the modern day dress version, where basically you just grab main frame, yep, you just grab the cape down here, you flip it once over your arm, and you can see that this gives me quite a good tangle, and I've got this leading edge here, which if it was a bit wall, it would have a bit more.
Turn a little to your right so we can see how it drapes. Yeah, there you go.
Yep. So it drapes down quite nicely. You can see I've got one solid wrap around the arm, so there's no part of my arm not covered, and it won't slip off or be exposed. Yep. So that's quite simple and very quick to prepare. The only part that I find that it doesn't comply with is Figgy says that preparing your cape is likely to obscure your vision. So basically, if we're preparing it like this, I really don't see how that could possibly obscure my vision. But it meets all the other criteria, and as I said, it was taken from their instructions on how to prepare your cape for walking around in the modern cape world of Spain. So not too bad. Combat-wise, I find that, especially with this material, that leading edge tends to be not enough beef to actually deflect rapiers when I need them to be deflected. So the other style that we have, I'm not even sure where we came from it, Lois, do you?
I think we got to it through experimentation. We were just trying to figure out how to make it work.
Oh yeah, how to wrap your cape around once. So he basically says to leave it on your sword shoulder for preparation. So this is my sword side, it's left on here. This one, we reach out behind ourselves. Some suggested there'd be a split in your cape seam at this point to make things easier. These ones, there's not. But anyway, and then you just bird wing it over so that it comes over, and you see that you've wrapped it over in the one time over. And now I've actually got about 3 pieces in this front area and this here. He also says that you need to leave your fingers out. And this is where the cape tends to be a smidge bit too long for me. You can see that if I do that naturally, it's going to cover my hand. So I want it just about there. He says to hold it with your thumb. Can I get that in there? So my thumb's purely covered in the cape, and then it's just holding it here. My fingers are free for whatever I might need or grab or whatever. We assume this is for conclusions and all the other things. He talks about not impeding your elbow in this. So you want to make sure that you can move your elbow out and around and keep it going. So that takes a little bit of planning. Okay, so now we've got it wrapped around our arm. Once again, we come to our L stance with our feet, and we're here. He says to put your hand out towards the hilt, slightly behind, and to arc your arm, so make a curve with that arm. You can see this is making a padded area in here where my cape is supported by air, which you see in, I think it's the Bolognese system. They suggest that you need several centimeters of air behind it to give you the impact resistance that you need. And I also find that it just gives you a bit of extra time before it actually hits you. So even the thrust that comes into there, it starts to pull and drag on the cape long before it actually is a direct threat to you. Okay, what do we do with it? So first of all, Figgy says, make sure we've prepared our cape out of measure. He says this several times, because obviously napping about with that is going to be a bit of a problem. And I think if anyone's watched any of our assessment gradings for the scholars, they've seen just how long it can take to prepare a cape. Yep, anyway, so that's a good point. He also says that there's a chance of obscuring your vision, which you can see in the second version that I do that, where I'm flaring my arm up over. I could well bring that in front of me and obscure my opponent, lose track of what's going on. Now we've come to our guard here with this around here. It says to use it to extend the job of the quillions. In this case, it's almost always going to be below, right? We don't exactly want the cape to come over. In fact, it says that all of our blows should be thrown above the cape. So we've got our arms here, and as we start the Atajo, we actually push that cape forward a little bit, and you can see that it starts to interfere. What's the best angle for that? You can see it starts to interfere down with any sort of disengage that they might be doing. I can do that with a lean. I can do that with a gain of my feet, which you can't see, but it's just bringing that cape into play and then transversing out and thrusting. Yeah, so it's just sort of bringing that cape into play during the Atajo, and then as you thrust out, it comes underneath. Now, it says to bring it to your chest in the thrust, just to ensure it doesn't get covered. Given that we've got it out here, that could mean bring it back to your chest so that it's well out of the way of your hip. Or it can just mean that as I profile in my transverse, that I bring it back to my chest so that I don't sacrifice any of my profile when I'm going into the right angle, the extreme right angle profile. Either of those is sort of acceptable. I certainly find that bringing it too much back here kind of defeats the purpose of having it out here to entangle. So it's only like more or less, once you start to use that profile, it comes towards your chest anyway. The other thing with ensuring that you deliver blows over the cape, I think this also comes into cuts. I'm going to try not to hit my own fan. And you can see that I'll bring this cut down on the inside here. Whereas normally I might bring it around, come a little further out, or use my profile. On this side, I'm definitely making sure that I'm cutting in next to the cape so that I'm not hitting my hand or the cape or trying to reach over my arm or cutting like, there goes the fan, like this with the crossed arm. So yeah, once again, it's keep it clear. And similarly, if I'm going the other way, you can see there's much less of a problem here. And you can see there where you might want to bring it in as you're coming through, just to make sure that you don't bring that hilt into the cape and tangle your own self. So basically, one of the things that we've extended upon that, I guess, with not necessarily much support, is during our transverse and thrust in, often they'll disengage, and then we'll just use that to deviate and thrust, which is definitely what Figgy says to do. The cape's just for deviations. It's not for parries. Don't stick it in the way of a cut or directly in front of a blow. It's to deviate the blows left or right, sort of push them out of their path. But an extension that we tend to find and use commonly is during the deviation to wrap around the blade as well. And that's just happenstance, I guess, kind of like a proto conclusion where you wind up their sword to keep going. That's something that we seem to support as meeting most of our Destreza criteria, but is not specifically mentioned within the figure. That's my 10 minutes on cape. Do we have any questions? Anybody?
Well, I feel like that was pretty thoroughly covered.
I've got one, which is how do you stop the cape from falling off of your shoulder? Or should you even worry about that?
Yep. So, oh, you can't see far enough. It has actually fallen off my shoulder a little bit, off my primary shoulder, but it tends to be because it's well seated on the top of the shoulder up here, that once it's wrapped around the arm, it becomes stationary from here to there. And I wish you could see my feet, but at the moment this cape is hovering just above my ankles. So there's no real way that I'm going to step on it if I'm using measured steps, which is kind of the longest cape you sort of want to do. So I think that's probably the important part, that when it's hanging off the one shoulder, that it's not dragging on the ground and getting in your own way. Other people tend to tie it around the body. I'm not super fond of that because then you get pulled around and has other issues. Similarly around the neck, and you want then your tie to break before it would choke you or anything like that, and that becomes an issue. A lot of the painting that we see, they're actually just grabbed it in this hand as they start to run, so you can see that they end up with this shoulder out Whether that's because it's also got a strap on underneath or not, I think that just depends on the details on the picture, whether you can see that. But it's certainly that they're holding it with your offhand here, and then up, fighting, and then grab it and go again. Theories? Okay, any more on Cape?
Yes, I've got something. Hello.
Hi.
I'm calling you from the Galaxy 42 logo. I heard it said from a random YouTube video on capes that I saw recently that in some ways a cape could be regarded as a superior offhand to a dagger. Pretending that that was true, could you give some reasons why that might be the case, whether you believe it or not?
Yeah, so Figgy certainly says it's the most prolific. So you're most likely to encounter rapier and cape, but he does prefer the dagger. So he says the dagger is, you know, the pinnacle of the offhands because it has that offensive as well as the defensive. In my mind, the cape is really easy to forget about, which is important if you need to focus on your primary weapon and what you're doing. And it also works as a really big shield. So a lot of people will just not attack that side at all. So if you've got that cape up and covered over here, that's pretty much covered off your entire inside line. So whereas your dagger, they'll work around it, they'll be baiting it to come wide or whatever. The cape is just there, it's just impeding it. It works really well.
Sean, we've got a question from Justin. He wants to know, can an opponent target your cape and cut it to shreds?
Can my opponent target my cape and cut it to shreds?
Yeah.
Probably. I hope I'm stabbing them in the face in the meantime. So what it does say is that when it's wrapped around your arm, even though I'm getting my authors mixed up. I know Figgy certainly says don't put it in the direct way of a cut, is because it'll still wound you, except in extreme measures where if you know the cut's going to hit you in the head, then sure, stick your cape in the way, it might have a better chance than your face. So this indicates that certainly the blades will cut the capes, and would they cut it to shreds? I think.
Can I add something here?
Yeah.
Okay. The reason I think it probably wouldn't get cut to shreds is because we're talking about wool, and we're talking about fairly thick wool.
Yeah, and the other thing, I don't think it matters. So, like, when it's wrapped around my arm, if it starts to be shredded into various pieces, you probably only get 4 or 5 cuts in there before something else happens bad to you. So then it'd be just like fairly loosely draped material, which effectively, it's fairly loosely draped material. So it wouldn't be until you actually manage to cut pieces off that it would become problematic. Yeah. So A, don't stick your arm in the way of a cut. So yep, cuts will damage the cape and you underneath it, especially if it's got a hard section there. But I think if they waste time trying to cut your cape, you should use that to as much advantage as we can.
When are you going to test that theory with sharps, Sean?
Never.
All right.
Not with those capes, not considering how long they took to make.
Yeah, well, actually, if you look at, I think
Ryan says he doesn't trust his own art. It's
Yeah.
trouble.
Yeah, and I mean, even these capes, they have got tears and so forth from thrusts and various other things. So it's not an indestructible super material. It's just cloth. Yeah. Anyway, should do for the length of the battle. You might need a new one at the end. Shall we move on?
Yep, there's no questions at the moment, so if you wanted to move on.
Okay, I'll kick myself off with another 10 minutes, maybe. So we'll move basically to a combination of the last two. So now we're going to the Rodela. So I certainly feel it's both a cape and a buckler all in one. So it's a cape in that it covers off that entire side of you. And it's a buckler in that it can take hard blows, and we see various things to do with it. Okay, what does Figgy say about the Rodela? How great it is. People have been using it since the dawn of time.
Can I just check on the pronunciation of, is it Rotella, Spanish, Rodela, Italian, or I've always wondered about that.
I believe
it's the other way
Rodela is Spanish and Rotella is Italian. Yes, Lois?
Yeah, so Rotella is Rotella, and that's Italian. Rodela, Rodela, is Spanish.
And I try to retrain myself to say Rodela all the time, but I can't roll the R. So, yep, anyway. We'll see how that goes.
Just be English and call it a round target.
Round target.
Yeah, works for Degrassi.
Yeah. Okay, so what did he say about this? He says that we need to have our elbow down. He says once again that we're looking to deviate with the edges. He also spends some time talking about being able to apply pressure at any of the points that the Rodela receives a hit. So one of our drills is to like work out how to use the structure of your arm and the supporting bands to be able to push against pressure at the various points on the Rodela. I presume this is so that there's no just weak point where it folds over or folds under and you're used to responding to that. But I also think this comes into the more forward-facing stance or argument where you're putting more of the shield in front of you. So it's not out here to the side and covering off. It's actually coming to that fore, and you need to reinforce this edge and be able to read where the blows and swords are. Figgy says the Rodela will obscure your vision. He doesn't say if that's a good thing. He doesn't say if that's a bad thing. He just says it will. So I think that's part of it too. It's like he's talking about reading the pressure so that you get to know whereabouts their sword is in times when you can't actually see it directly. Okay, so we've got our elbow down, arched, and we're coming to our normal L stance again. So you can see we're just kind of like this. And once again, we're starting to edge this. Not sure how to show that best. So I could be straight on, edge strike type, but really it's less gap in here, much more square on to the opponent. You can still see that I've got this area between here and my sword to vision, and that this is high enough that blows are deflected over my head, just like the buckler were. So once again, it's sort of up here. Once again, Rodela doesn't move. You just leave it there. So it's pretty much its job. It's covered out that entire inside line. So as I was saying, often happens with Cape. It needs to happen with Rodela. If anyone's attacking that side, they're just wasting their time. So you get to do as you please. Okay, so once again, you can use it underneath your weapon if you need to, but you don't want to move it outside your body edge. So it's like you just bring it to here, and it only tends to be in the more extreme cases when they're retaking the strength and disengaged under or so forth. It says that you should deliver all your blows below the Rodela. I don't think that means like we did with buckler, where we're trying to go below our own Rodela. I think it means more under the cover of your Rodela. So it's sort of out here, and I can thrust under the cover of my Rodela. What I'm not doing is going over my Rodela or outside my Rodela, which all seem rather awkward things to do anyway. So the exception to that would be the one that I just talked about, where we're actually already delivering that thrust, and then we need to just shut out that inside, shut out that outside line. What else did he say? So similar to in the section where he says that bucklers will take more of the parries and blows and clear the way for your delivery of attacks. I think that's that same sort of thing where this side is safe. So if they're attacking my inside at all, I can more or less just worry about clearing my own path for the attack. Once again, you don't want to be blinding yourself and not covering out that bottom area. So this can be another one of those cases where you're essentially handing off from the big round protection thing to the sword thing. So I certainly know that a common play against people with Rodela is to like thrust high, so they go like this, and they can't see, and they're actually fainted and thrusted low. So I think Figgy's counter to that is A, to keep it here and don't move it. We've got it in a spot where it's high enough that you're pretty much, your thrust is not going to go over unless you roll your hand into the downward sort of thrust. And what was I saying? Oh yeah, and then so we can safely sort of come in on that. And then by having this sword down here, we're cutting off any redirects to our outside line. All right, outside. I don't suggest the same buckler sort of thing that we're doing here. On your outside, really needs to be the sword first and the sword in the high. If your Rodela is at all coming over to this side, it's underneath because something's gone weird and wrong. Trying to push this over your arm, you're going to get nowhere. Like, best case, you're hitting them in the knee. You're really vulnerable lifting up the big heavy thing, and they're probably going to use the fact that it's quite close to your body to be able to strike into the areas that are closed, like the upper outside shoulder and inside belly. Yeah.
Sorry, Sean, while I've got you there, when you say Rodela and Rodela, are they referring to the same thing, or do Spanish have a particular dimension for their Rodela?
Yeah, so Spanish say that it should be 3 palmo wide. So this one's pretty close to 3 palmo. So, oops, I've done it in the funny range again. Anyway, trust me, it's about 3 hands wide. 3 palmo, so it's about this big, pretty much the same as the Italian descriptions that I've seen. It says it should be dished like this, and I think he also is the one that says of a material that doesn't obscure your vision. So
we should, just to be specific, it's probably not accurate to say the Spanish say. It is accurate to say that Figueiredo says.
yes,
That these are dimensions of the Rodela.
And he's Portuguese, so even worse.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So Ryan is asking where the measurement comes from, and it's from that transition of the Rodela section.
Yeah.
Which I should review anyway.
Yeah, so he likes measuring only of his offhands in palmos, so it's like either 2 or 3 is pretty much it, except the cape. He doesn't tell us what that is. So yeah, it's 3 diameter. Yeah, he doesn't say what it should be made of. It's just like a light curved material that shouldn't obscure your vision or something like that. It just generally got to the transparent aluminium. Will be fine.
Is it? Excuse me. Is it supposed to be curved? Really? Like, is that actually in the recipe?
Yeah,
Awesome.
he says it should be dished. So like in this direction, not just round, but also on that length.
Can it have a boss and still be a Rodela? You're the boss.
Yeah. So in Figgy's description, it doesn't have a boss.
Okay.
But this comes back to exactly what Lois is saying. What am I talking about? I'm talking about one book, one guy, one occurrence of it. So in this particular case, his Rodela did not have a boss. But that's not to say it's not a Rodela if it's got a boss.
To jump in very quickly about that boss thing, it would seem counterintuitive to have a boss on your Rodela because you have a boss to fit your hand if you're holding it with your single hand. But if you've got your arm through it, then a boss is maybe not necessary.
That's
the only function
you
of the
does say
boss.
that it should strap onto your arm, and that's where you get that elbow down sort of stance for it too, so that it gives you that support. Ryan, just asked the question. Was that any good?
Jim's also made a comment. He said, Figgy's saying buckler is 2 palmo and Rodela is 3 palmo, then not actually a lot larger.
22 centimeters, so half again. But yeah, when you
Kate's responding saying it's a much bigger area though.
Sorry?
Kate sort of added a much bigger area though, so
Yeah. That's right, it's that diameter. So once we make a circle out of that, it gets pretty big.
Yeah.
It also gets pretty heavy. So regularly, if you make a buckler out of poor choice of materials, it's not much lighter than a rodela, and, and you get to use your whole arm to hold the rodela up. So that's a good sign.
Yeah, and if you look at the buckler section, Figueiredo says specifically he wants you to use a large. He wants you to use a buckler on the larger end of bucklers. So if you have a larger buckler, it's going to be closer to the size of a rodela.
I did have a question too about the Rodela. Because we've moved on from cape, cape seemed the more obvious choice for on the street, defending yourself, that kind of thing. And Rodela seemed to be more of a military offhand.
So
And were they used with rapiers, or were they just used with slide swords or different kinds of swords?
So the time period for Figgy is probably tending towards rapiers that we would call rapier. So I believe it's used with both. Like I said earlier, he did say that rapier and cape is your most common. It's always going to be there. Rapier and dagger are your most noble or most useful. He says something about the rodellas being out of fashion, but had been great in its previous time and gone all the way back to Romans and all sorts of
Oh
things.
yeah, he waxes poetic about the Rodela.
Yeah, so I think he's a little nostalgic for it, which to me means that it's probably not that common. If you look at some of the Montante plays, they're talking about town guards having to cut off the legs of people using rodellas. So it seems like when you're out to make trouble, you take a rodela. If you're just out for a beer, you take a cape. But yeah, so I suggest not solely military. That's probably where that's going. Does that cover your question?
Yep.
Yeah, and in military use, they were quite common in the 16th century, but I'm not sure about Spain specifically, but in the other contexts that I'm more familiar with, they were definitely on the way out in the 17th century. So
Spain was actually relying on them quite heavily for their tercios. So if you were one of the arquebusiers, if you were assigned a firearm, you can carry your firearm stand, your firearm, a side sword, and a rodela. In fact, in the movie that we just watched in A la Triste, I believe we saw some rodellas in play. Not in the civilian fights, but on the field.
Yeah, and I think just the very nature of the rodela is going to make it like you're going to leave it at home unless you know you're in trouble. So
Ryan is saying the rodelero had a bad reputation for looking for fights.
fair enough. There you go.
if you don't like that
hit me
thing
through this
around
big wall
unless
of
you're planning on
steel?
using it.
Yeah, the buckler is sort of less suspicious, I guess. Though, like Jim said, once you've got a 2 palmo buckler, that's gonna not sit on your hip nicely. It's sort of going to be pretty obvious and in the way. Okay, let's move along. We're moving to bracer. So Figgy blends the bracer and gauntlet section. So the gauntlet he describes as basically a bracer with a section over your hand as well. He'll say that the gauntlet has hard metal on the outside with a layer of chain on the inside. He also says that you'll often have that chain sandwiched between pieces of leather. So I presume that's so it gives it a nice amount of grip on the outside and protects your hand a bit from the chain on the inside. The fan brace says sheet of steel, possibly 2, and yeah, once again, can be sandwiched between material. He also talks about the false diestros who will teach you that you just leave it back here, and when they overcommit, that's the time that you use it. So what he's saying there basically is there's an obvious time to use it when they've overcommitted and come in, and it's sort of in your conclusion range. That's all well and good, but if you follow the directions of Figgy, you'll get to use it much more often and win many, many more battles. Just asking. Okay, so Figgy basically says to have your hand forward, not arched out like the cape, but straight and slightly elbowed down. So that becomes more like this. Basically using the hilt to cover out the front of your hand if you're not using a gauntlet. And then you've got this, the hard edge in the way of scrap that's coming on the inside there. So you're sort of going to have that inherent covering out of that inside just without even terribly much motion either. So the part that becomes much more vicious interpretation of some of the words is the moving of the bracer. So basically he says to push it forward and get it involved in the fight. And he's talking about the number of ways that the bracer and gauntlet can occupy and harass the opponent's weapon to make clearer ways for the sword to strike. When we originally read that, we thought it was saying to clear the way for many strikes from the bracer, which he does say that you can strike with the bracer, but it's and you could even maybe strike with the bracer, which is much more like you're in conclusion time, maybe that's time. The gauntlet, it becomes more obvious that that's sort of like your punching distance. I'm sure Chris Leeman's going to be happy with that. But primarily, it seems what he's suggesting is that it's used to deviate the blade and clear the way for the sword. So some of the ways that we can do that is when you're under the Atajo, you can use, once the point starts to come past your hilt, you can use a slightly raised gauntlet or bracer to apply pressure to there and either use the strength underneath and shoot for a lower hip, or actually then free your blade for your own actions on top. Certainly with the gauntlet, it becomes much more when you've got the Atajo, you can follow it up with a grab. Similarly, with the Atajo, it's up here, it's in your high line. If they disengage to come to the inside, and deviate with the bracer and thrust in high. Yeah, he seems super vigorous with his bracer and gauntlet. It's like all about get in there, make sure it's active, make sure you're taking actions with it to interfere and free up new paths for your sword to strike that it wouldn't have if you didn't have a bracer. For me, a bracer, especially one that doesn't cover my elbow, seems very risky every time I stick it in the way of anything. I muchly prefer the gauntlet, where you can actually grab and control the blades. There's many times where you'll be thrusting in, just grabbing the blade over your own blade to allow you to disengage and keep going. Or even when you start the Atajo and subject, you can pass that off into a grab like we were saying earlier. Yeah, so much as he's super fanboy of it, he doesn't actually give us much to go on exactly how to do those plays. So he certainly says that the van brace has never really gone out of style and it's always been used by commanders and people in charge. But yeah, other than don't just leave it back here and wait for your opportunity to deviate and go. So he says don't just do that, indicating we can do that. And do also bring it forward and interfere and build your own path, new paths for the blade to strike. Any questions or anything that we cover in class that you might think is good to bring up there? No? Okay. Okay, so we bring on to our final form, which is the dagger. And I think my time is running pretty close to right because our racer was a bit short. Okay, so with dagger, this is the one.
Give yourself 15 for dagger.
Sorry?
Give yourself 15 for dagger.
Well, that's okay. It's at the end, so we just go until everybody gets bored and glazes over, right? So once again, he measures his offhand in palmos. So we've got 2 palmos for the entire dagger. Initial translation kind of said that that was half, but it actually turns out that you want the blade to be 2/3. So we don't want a 2 palmo dagger with a 1 palmo blade. We want a 2 palmo dagger with 2/3 of the dagger being blade, which gives you a quite small one compared to most of the other ones that we'll see around the place. Okay, so he has. So we initially started the dagger work based purely on our workshop in Canada and what we could manage to remember and put together from that. So just recently, Lois has finished the dagger translation, and we've started to revise some of the things and change some of the items. One of the things that we started doing. Okay, so he talks about having your dagger at a virtuous position. I'm just going to spin around a few times. So we're basically 45 across the top there and 45 forward, so that we can sort of interfere and cover off. So we're in the middle. We're not straight up. We're certainly not flat and in parallel with the weapons, because that's completely useless, which I totally agree with. And yeah, it comes across the line. This tends to be used for times when you're below the blade, or when they're subjecting you, or as part of your narrowing in the bottom. I find it a godsend in tournaments to finish off that narrowing, because you basically, especially in left-handed, so narrowing, we bring it around, we're underneath and we're thrusting in. The most common problem here is misreading that pressure, and they disengage into your high line. So you lose their blade at the important point, or even just after the strike, and then they come across into that high line. And you can see this dagger push forward and across means that when they come up into that area to strike at the face or whatever, it's controlled and cut out. That's really nice. If you're doing it in the manner of narrowing, one of the deviations that we tend to do is I'll tend to put it across in the other direction. So normally we've got our 45 this way. From narrowing to that outside, I'll tend to 45 to that outside to deliver that thrust there. As far as I know, there's nothing configured to support that, other than saying to give yourself a good medio across the line in both directions. The other part of the position, so that's like dagger rule 1, which is our up position with a medio in 45-45 or halfway, virtuous middle, whatever the choice. The other one is down. So we initially taught this little finger to little finger, making sure our sword, dagger's blade is perpendicular, so that any blows come in on the edges, and it's pointed directly at the ground. So it's totally a T when I'm in my right angle. Okay, and then we take an Atajo, and that can move or not move as it needs to. On later revision, so that's what Puck taught us in Canada, and even after their trial, it was fairly new for them as well. And after the trialing, both Puck and Eric came to the decision that that was not working well for them in combat. Maybe they needed to go read what the words actually say, and make sure they were doing the right thing. And yeah, so basically, and we can see it now in Lois's translation. It actually talked to me about that when we were over in the States, and I sort of thought, okay, let's not just tell Lois the reasons for that yet. Let's let her translate that uninfluenced and see if her translation came across the same way. And you can see very clearly from her translation that it gives some details about exactly where this is and what positions and what vertage. And basically, it says the other one is the same, but pointed towards the ground, pointed to the ground. So you can see how they go, okay, it's pointed to the ground. But the newer interpretation is more like the same, but pointed to the ground. So generally towards the ground, not directly at the ground. So we're still trying to get our edges aligned, so it comes in on the sides of our dagger. But instead of being towards the ground, we're doing that 45 forwards and a little bit offline as well. So you can see that. And this allows us to feed into their plan earlier, which is to basically extend your quillions. So there's a lot of this offhand weapons theory where it's about extending your quillions and making it more difficult for the opponent's sword to deviate around. You can see if I've got my sword like this, my dagger like this, and they're up around the quillion area, I'm not forcing them to do anything extra because they're in front of my dagger. As opposed to like this, where You can see that dagger's pushing out forwards, and it's actually causing them to do a bigger disengage. Oh, you can't see my dagger, it's too tiny. If I hold it badly, you can see the flat of the dagger. Yeah, you can see that out here, it's forcing them to need to disengage earlier than my Quillians and more than all of my Quillians. So the only time, I must say, unlike a lot of people, I became quite fond of the transition from here to here and then get it done and quite fast. A lot of the time, I would stop midway to do those sorts of things, but it was always consciously on my way to here. It's just sometimes I might not get there before I change my mind to go back that way. The only time that I really consciously use directly down anymore is basically when I'm catching large cuts. So when I'm catching a large cut, I'll sort of make this, what is that, a V, a Y, depending if you want to include my arms, so that we've got, ideally it's coming into here to catch into my Quillians and blade protection, but also if they disengage low, this is going as low as it possibly can to cover off as much as my low area. Yep, and then they're talking about going from high to low and low to high, just as we need. So that's kind of like the natural transition to where we're going. As a general rule, we normally talk about having it low when we're taking in Atajos or catching cuts or catching reverses or taking your Atajo on the other side. You've got it low when you're in control. When they're on top of your blade, you've got it high. This tends to be, this tends to translate to anywhere where your blade, where your sword's not, is where your dagger needs to be. So when my dagger is on top, when my sword's on top, my dagger's below. When my sword's below, my dagger's on top. And that sort of gives us this interesting transition. Then becomes the question of when I'm doing a narrow, the generals, the spirals, do I like leave it in the low position because I started with an Atajo? Do I like do a quick change like this? Or how do I use this? So I already said the great advantage of having dagger high when we're in the narrowing. So if I'm doing my narrowing, I'll take the Atajo with the dagger low, and as I come around, it'll slide into the dagger high and cover it off. Whereas if I'm a bit further around and I'm doing, say, a line and a cross, I'll know that I'm coming back into that top area. I may well just leave that in that lower area and come into it later. Oh yeah, and his last one is the sword and dagger can separate only to the daggers outside, which seems obvious, right? This is the side that we deviate around, and we can use it for desvios and desvioses. Desvios is dope. Desvios. Oh damn it! Where was I going to go with that? So size of the cut the dagger can deal with. When we started, we're very much on that. You don't just block a cut with your dagger, which I'm still firmly in that camp. So if we've got a large toe coming in at me and I just stick my dagger out because I'm separated to the outside, this is perfectly valid and good. I think there's a very anti-Distreza pattern in this, in that I'm relying on a little tiny area here to make sure they actually cut into that spot. And then it gets into whether, hitting the top of the dagger is weak, or if I don't use a good Atajo type action to catch their cut even with the dagger, like if I'm like this, it'll just fold over, or if I'm too far like this, it'll just miss it completely. But even in our experimentation, without having done the translation, we very quickly found that there's times, see, Lois is right, I needed more than 10 minutes for dagger. There's times when you'll be catching reverse cuts. So it's just here, you've done a thing and they're like doing a little half cut, you'll catch that as you go in and blade in. And this is the time where you've got the VY wall of steel sort of coming across and they're just catching that. Once again, we're feeding this in like an Atajo because we've got our 45-degree angle on the side here. So we'd already gone to the, okay, we can't catch cuts, but there seems like half cuts, small reverses, that seems like practical. We're like more deflecting our blade rather than just sticking our dagger out and hoping to catch it. In the translation, now that we've read it with Lois, he seems much more fond of being able to defend cuts with the dagger, though he talks about primarily reverses and small cuts. So that's pretty much still what we've got. And I think we're still good with, like, if they're just throwing a big open cut and you separate to the outside, it's not really just as a safety first type approach to the problem. Pretty sure Jacob was going to have an argument to the counter of that for one of his virtual Atajo talks, so I look forward to hearing that one too. What haven't I covered in Dagger? So yeah, we've got Dagger high, Dagger low, Dagger high to low. We've got separate to the outside. Any questions? No?
Well, Jess says still best to use small movements with a dagger. Is that the case?
I don't think he's specific about it, is he, guys?
I've been
movements, but it says things like you're rotating around your center, and you
you want to make circles with the wrist, yeah.
Arm. So it's still sort of like keep it in this narrow scope. So he's not fond of these ones. Another one to that countering, sticking my arm out to catch a cut. So yeah, I think you're right. He expresses it differently, but I think it's the same outcome where he's talking about ensuring your spirals are around the wrist and ensuring it doesn't leave this shoulder area.
Yep.
Anything else?
Do you want to talk about unifying theories that sort of like there's a running theme through all of Figgy's offhands?
Yeah, so the biggest, first and most obvious is the offhand is ancillary. So you're primarily just doing your fencing with your sword. The bracer seems to be the one where he's most saying, oh, don't just do what you do with your sword, make sure you get this bracer in there and mix things up. Most of the offhand weapons, he's not, he doesn't talk about them being offensive. So he says the dagger is most noble in the fact that it can play all the roles of the sword, presumably stabbing people as well. But he does also say that bracer can punch folk or gauntlet. There are a lot of times trying to work out how to strike with a bracer seems a bit challenging. And I think that's in that far too close conclusion type area. Most of the theory of the uses, it all seems to be about what we're talking about, sort of briefly batted around, the extending the quillions. So we've got high and diagonal out, and we've got low and on that inside. With our cape, we've got it dangling down to be our quillion area. With our buckler, we've got it up here. That's not quite the quillion, but certainly we cover off in our low area, or we use it to extend the high quillion for our counter thrust. Yeah, I know a lot of the other Distressor authors seem to say that the offhands are used for conclusion type activities. He doesn't seem so big on that. I mean, he doesn't say don't do that, but he's not saying that's their only use. And with his lower focus on them being offensive weapons, I think he's much more like, with the cape, you still get your fingers out. So conclusions is still a thing that you do. And it's like the bracer is saying to strike people with it. Really, you're going to be in that conclusion sort of distance to be able to have any chance of hitting somebody with your forearm. Except maybe against their forearm or their own hand.
So Ryan has supplied the text from the translation that matches what you were saying. He writes, and because all of the offhand weapons are used solely to assist the sword, excusing it from certain movements in accordance with the offhand weapon in question, The diestro should not ignore what the dagger is intended to do, which is deviate the opponent's sword toward one side or the other, and to perform some of the minor parries, primarily against reverse attacks, which are taken when within distance of the opponent.
Yep, cool. So yeah, and I think that also speaks to that general offhand theory there as well, where he starts in like the primary purpose of your offhand is to be the support and allow you to stab them with the long sword.
Yeah. If there's one phrase I remember clearly being in almost every single section is use the offhand to force your opponent to make bigger circles.
Yep, and yeah, that's what I was getting at. If it wasn't clear from extend the quillions, it's like why are we extending the quillions? Exactly what Laura said, to force them to make larger circles. Give us more time in their disengage. Give us more opportunities, as that dagger section was saying, to use our sword at liberty. Cool. Is there any more?
Any more questions?
No, that's pretty good. Anyway, brief intro. I've covered all 5 weapons in, well, I think we just ticked over an hour
About an
now.
hour. Yeah.
So, yep, pretty good thing to get started. I hope it starts some discussion, and yeah, we go from there. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Back time.
Thank you very much, Sean. That concludes the formal part of the session. I'll just stop recording now.